All right. Well, good morning, everyone, on this snowy morning, and I'd like to welcome Tom McKay. We're very fortunate to have someone who loves and really understands the history of the railroad in the region. He's also an industry professional, so we're very excited about this program. And we're going to ask that if you have questions, you'd put them in the chat, and then from time to time, Tom will pause to take a break to see if there's any questions. If you got something really urgent or clarifying, you use the raise your hand so you can see that you're asking. And you can also put comments and discussion in the comment section. So with that, I will turn it over to Tom, and thank you so much and welcome.
Sure, thank you. And I can see your hat, by the way. That's a good, appropriate headwear for this course today. Um, and yeah, so thank you so much for Chesapeake Forum for having me out to do this course. Should be very interesting for everybody with any luck. Um, I'd like to add at the beginning here, like I'm connected using a satellite connection, so
Hmm?
shouldn't be any issues, but I can't guarantee with any luck the next hour and a half here will be stable and we won't have any problems. But if there are, I'll try to do my best to get back on here like anybody else. Also with the snow, you know, we're going to adjust our my plan here slightly. Ideally, hopefully you got an email with some attachments here that one way or the other you can visualize as we go. There's a map and then there's a timeline. In a perfect world, I would have handed these out in the classroom, which we won't be able to do until next week. But in the meantime, we'll just try to do the best we can. If there are sort of residual confusion or questions about many of the things, then we can resolve those maybe next week while we're all together. Because what we're going to do today is we're going to jump around pretty significantly geographically. We're also going to go through generally a chronology, right? Any story sort of unfolds over the course of time. And so there's a lot of different moving parts to sort of keep track of. But what I would like to try to do with this course is not dive too deeply into any one um, piece or any one local story, but I want to sort of cover the industry, or not the industry, but the sort of peninsula, the Delmarva Peninsula as a whole, and give everybody sort of a framework for the events that have unfolded that have created the rail network that once was and that still is today. So this is the first time I've presented this slideshow, even though I have created it. So I don't know exactly how it will play out. Hopefully, it will be appropriate length. So forgive me if we run a little short or long. We'll adjust again for next week as well. So we'll see where we go from there. And as you'll see as we go, I've used many sources. There's a couple of slides here which are original, sort of my own work, but the vast majority of this is from research from others. I'm going to refer to many books throughout the course of this, which I've pulled information from. Many of those books are still available. In fact, just about all of them are still available somewhere. And if you're so inclined, you can, go and acquire one of those books or borrow it and read more in depth about any one individual area. If you'd like to, continue that, and I'll explain a little bit more about that as we go. And also, I think probably on this call, there's like a significant amount of local knowledge. So I cannot actually profess to say that I'm a local historian, right? I would consider myself more of an industry historian, amateur at that. But I do know that there's a lot of local knowledge about various aspects of the area here. Sometimes those overlap very cleanly with the story that I'm going to try to tell. and sometimes they're not so related. But either way, we're going to probably see some connections come out here that we maybe didn't already know about, which is going to be one of our goals with talking about this. I think that's it. And I did mention the snow. So to start us out, I've shared this photograph here. This is a train this is in 1899, what was called the Blizzard of 1899. And this train is on its way to Easton. It's going to pick us all up and take us to the Chesapeake Forum. But unfortunately, it was stuck and snowbound. So here we are. Without the benefit of Zoom in 1899, I guess everybody just stayed home. And like I said, once again, thanks for joining. I guess I put spring 2025 on this in this title slide, even though I guess we're still in winter. So I'll correct that by next week. Is this going to work? There we go. So I can introduce myself. As I said, my name is Tom McKay. I live in the area, and my wife and I moved to the area a couple years ago. But I'm just about a lifelong Marylander. Have worked across the state in various different things. Graduate of Frostburg State University out in Western Maryland. Worked for CSX Transportation for a number of years out in Western Maryland as well. Lived in Baltimore City. Went to school in Baltimore City and lived longer in Baltimore City. During that time, I got the chance to work for MARC Train Service, which is the commuter railroad that operates between Baltimore and Washington. Lots of stories and background from that, which we won't go into today, but sort of different timeline for state rail history going on the Western Shore. Nowadays, I work in the Department of Transportation. You can look me up. I'm online and see some of the things that we're up to. My interests, dogs. We have two very great dogs with us. I'm into cycling, plants and gardening, and also cars, especially old cars. So good to see everybody this morning. Thank you for joining us today, and hopefully we will learn something together here. Here's our schedule for the course. This is February 12th. I'm calling this Section 1, and the title of the presentation today is Hopes and Dreams. And we're going to roughly cover some 60, 70 years from 1827 roughly to about 1880. And this is our boarding call for this course. Next week, we will go through Section 2, which will cover roughly 1890 to 1972. Section 3 will follow on February 26th. And then on that following Friday, the 28th, there is a visit to the Railroad Museum of Pennsylvania scheduled. It's not directly part of this course. It's an add-on. And I will try to relate many of the things that we're going to talk about today directly to things that are at the Railroad Museum of Pennsylvania, so that by the time we go on that Friday, we will hopefully have a nice contextual understanding of some of the stuff that we're looking at and how it's relevant to the Delmarva Peninsula specifically. So as I mentioned, there's a lot of good books out there. Perhaps the best overall book is disconnected. Can you still hear me?
Yes, we can still hear you.
Yep.
Somebody decided to call me during this, and now I have to. All right, sorry about that. Sorry about that. So one of the better books that are available is Rails Along the Chesapeake by John C. Heyman. This book is from 1979. It's out of print, but there are still copies of it around. And this is a very good resource for the general timeline and digging into some odds and ends. There's a number of other books we will talk about more next week. One of the better ones with a lot more photographs in it is Abandoned Railroads of Delmarva by Douglas Poor. This was also a helpful reference for this presentation. And I hope if we were in person, I would have had a stack of books here potentially for you could thumb through and look at, but that will have to wait until next week. All right, so I have a quote here to begin, and this is, the quote says, "We may expect to have soon, on our much neglected and misrepresented Eastern Shore, one of the straightest, most level, cheapest, and most profitable roads to be found on the face of the globe." And this was President Thomas Emory of the Eastern Shore Railroad Company in 1838. Come back to that. All right, so any good story has to have a beginning point. And if I can get my Zoom box here to not cover my notes up, that's good. Okay. So we're going to start with John Smith and his very famous travel up the Chesapeake Bay and exploring the Chesapeake region in 1608. So at this time, when John Smith first sailed up the Chesapeake Bay, he entered a world where there was no infrastructure at all, just almost pure wilderness by any modern standard. And it's important that we try to consider, take ourselves back to this world, potentially, and to try to think about how challenging travel was at this very beginning moment, at least in American history. Where water travel sort of was the only way you could get around, right? At least as far as land travel, you had very thick forests, you had unmodified wetlands, swamps, right, which were impossible to travel through. There were an extensive network of Native American pathways that had evolved over many, many hundreds of years. And these pathways traveled over land, but they also existed via waterways, right, of our creeks, rivers, and bays. And this was the sort of only way that peoples, either native or colonial or European peoples, could travel around, right? So the Lenni Algonquin people exerted the greatest political and economic control over the country in this region, right? And their geography sort of spanned from New Jersey through eastern Pennsylvania and along the Delaware Bay to its mouth at Cape Henlopen. More inland in the state of Maryland, right? We had Susquehannock peoples, and they lived in fortified villages along the Susquehanna River. And they were especially determined to maintain independence from European settlers during the fur trade that evolved, and would eventually sort of parlay or play different nationalities of settlers against each other, including the Swedes, the Dutch, and the English. So they were very astute native people who were also sort of very rooted in commerce from a very early time. In 1681, William Penn convinced the English crown to grant him a charter of 45,000 square miles, on the western side of the Delaware River, with a southern boundary on the river 12 miles north of Newcastle. 2 years later, the Duke of York deeded him possession of the 3 Delaware counties of Newcastle, Kent, and Sussex. So very early on, Delaware was not its own sort of political unit, it was part of the state of Pennsylvania. And around that time, William Penn of Pennsylvania and Charles Calvert of Maryland, right, were competing for influence in the New World, in the colonies here. And one interesting footnote of history is that there was actually a war fought over the boundary line between Maryland and Pennsylvania. This was called Cresap's War. And this was in the 1730s. Pennsylvania claimed much more land, getting down close to actually Baltimore City, right? And state of Maryland claimed a significant amount of Pennsylvania, right, as part of its original grant. And so with this context, we can see, the beginning of rivalries forming between Pennsylvania and Maryland. We can see the beginning of competition for transportation, right? Competition to reach and exploit natural resources. And all of these things are going to be key ingredients to understanding how our transportation system evolved. One thing I want to point out on this slide, and you'll see this on another bunch of slides, is I have made a little icon called sidetrack. This is a sidetrack warning. What this means is that this particular topic, we're going to try not to go into too much detail on. However, this is its own, potentially its own line of discussion, right, or study, which would be very interesting maybe to see future Chesapeake Forum classes on, perhaps not by me, but perhaps by someone, because there is just sort of a wealth of information out there and a good story to hear, right, about the pre-colonial sort of development of our region. However, we're going to move on. We're going to go to the colonial era. All right, so we're going to fast forward a little bit, and we're going to think about, okay, now we're in sort of perhaps colonial, like maybe pre-revolution United States, or right around the time of the revolution, right? What was it like to travel? Well, traveling really was not significantly different from when Smith sailed up the Chesapeake in 1608, right? With the minor exceptions of a couple of very poor stagecoach roads, which we're going to cover in this subsequent slide here. But the state of the art really still was water transportation, right? If you had to go anywhere, right, it was via a ship, a sailing ship, like the one we see here. These were sort of well developed by this time, but also highly dependent on the skill of the crew, right? The sort of condition of the ship, the environmental inputs, right? Like you need wind, right? You can't determine where the wind blows, etc. So while these types of sailing ships were crucial to the development of our region in the Chesapeake Bay, they had some definite drawbacks. Limited capacity as well was another main one. But because of their prominence, we can see sort of the Chesapeake Bay developing, and the bay itself, right, and the rivers and creeks of the bay itself, including the Delaware Bay as well, sort of these becoming the sort of highways, the first highways of commerce and transportation that we had, that were crucial to the development of our cities and towns. So you see, we'll get to we'll talk about another couple of these towns later, but we have cities like Annapolis, Cambridge, right? These are all developing on waterways as major ports. Some other options other than stagecoach or ship is you could walk, right? Which you wouldn't want to have to walk from here to, say, New York City and back. That would take a while, although it was done. You could ride a horse, right? That would take about a week. And neither one of those options was particularly advantageous, especially when you had to sort of find your own accommodations over the course of many days. Can I move forward a slide? Here we go. So as the roadway system developed in colonial and maybe now post-revolution United States, there were a number of roads that just by their sort of just sheer usefulness or sheer frequency of use, right, developed into thoroughfares or corridors of importance, not through any sort of central planning or sort of deliberate act, but just because, all right, because of geography. And
Thomas, can you pause for a minute?
sure.
I have Annabelle Lesher is saying she cannot see your slides. Is there anybody else that can't see slides? I'm wondering if it's her setting or if something's happened. I
Yeah,
can
I
see
can
them.
see them clearly.
see
I'm not
them.
sure what the problem is.
Yeah, so Annabelle, if you could check your view setting, it's possible you have it set on just the speaker and you want to change it. You can do side-by-side speaker or immersive, and that will show you just the slides. But it depends on if you're using a tablet or a computer where it is. So
You know, I'll
sorry,
tell
I
you
just
what,
wanted to make sure it was just a single person.
I'll connect with Annabelle and try and help her through it, Trina.
Oh, okay. Thank you, Doug. Sorry, Thomas.
Oh no, perfect. Yeah, we want to make sure it continues to work.
All right, so go ahead. If he's going to
Yeah.
go off on the side and take care of it.
All right, so early colonial roads, right? We had significant interest in the original 13 colonies of the United States to travel north and south along the eastern seaboard, right? Via, so that all the colonies could be tied together. There was also significant interest slightly later on in traveling east to west to reach the interior of the continent. And a lot of the major rivers, such as the Susquehanna, Potomac, Delaware, Hudson River, sort of obstructed the travel largely north and south. However, they did help expedite the travel east and west. So if you're trying to, say, travel north to south between sort of Virginia, Maryland, Pennsylvania, New Jersey, New York, there were some significant rivers that you had to navigate. The Potomac, the Susquehanna, Delaware. And in a world where bridges didn't exist yet, significant bridges like these did not exist, you were left with the decision of, okay, do I find a ferry crossing? Do I swim, right? Do I try to find someone with a boat? And so we did see ferry crossings were very common along these roads. Some ferries like these still exist today. But even so, these were slow. They were not always reliable. And before too long, the preference sort of became, well, if I'm going to get in a boat anyway, I might as well just go to a harbor, get on like a packet-style boat, and then I'll just head up to New York, right? And I'll just go the entire way via ocean-going ship of some kind, right? That way I don't have to deal with any of this inland stuff at all. And that was still, for a time, the preferred way. However, as we mentioned already, there were limits to this. So we have a couple examples here of some cheaper alternatives and the beginning of what was called stagecoach lines, right? So this is a actual advertisement that I was able to find from a stagecoach line. This would have been printed in a paper, and what it says, because it's hard to read, but I can read it here. It says, "This is the safest and cheapest conveyance from Philadelphia to New York. Starts at the Green Tree Inn every morning, precisely at 8 o'clock. Roads are excellent and line is in complete order. Dine at Buckingham, lodge at Somerville, New Jersey, breakfast the next morning at Plainfield, and arrive at Powell's Hook at 11 a.m. Stage fare $5, which is $175 today, and 50 cents fee per meal. So what this is essentially this is a Bolt bus, right? Like this is a Greyhound, um, and it's interesting to look at costs and availability of these services because for $175, that's pretty steep. If you had to get a bus from Philadelphia to New Jersey today, just about New York, right? That's pretty steep. That's not real competitive price anymore, right? So traveling was very expensive overland, even though the advent of improved roads was starting to help this, right? Even so, the stagecoaches only helped you overland, right? So we had a Philadelphia to Powell's Hook, which is near Staten Island, right? So we had a Philadelphia to Powell's Hook leg. Uh-oh, I have a box here, Trina, that says the host has asked you to start your video. Oh, okay.
Oh, there.
I'm back
Yeah,
on.
for some reason it had stopped. So
Okay.
now we can see you again. We could see the slides, but we lost you. But now you're back.
Okay. So we have links overland for stagecoaches, right? And then we still have these major rivers, which are troublesome, especially the Delaware River, right? Where you'd have to go back onto a ship near Wilmington or Newcastle and take a ferry or a ship up to either Philadelphia or Trenton, where you could go no further, right? You could get back on a stagecoach and go the rest of the way. So there was a pattern that developed, right, which was stagecoach, ship, stagecoach, ship, stagecoach, and then to get to New York, right, would be the final leg would be by ship again, or ferry boat. But these systems, even though they were more complicated, did lead to improving the rates of travel pretty dramatically. So in 1800, these maps below are they're showing sort of rates of travel from New York, right? It would take 2 days to reach, or about a day to reach Philadelphia, about 2 days to reach what we would call like maybe Wilmington, about 3 days to reach Baltimore, about 4 days to reach Washington. And by just 30 years later, right, you could get from New York to Wilmington in a day, and you could get beyond Washington even in 2 days, which is a significant improvement. Let's see if I can go ahead one. All right, so in this world of sort of back and forth between water and overland transportation, the stagecoach lines did okay, but pretty quickly were overwhelmed by both demand and also the costs of maintaining the roadways themselves. So we see first the advent of turnpikes that connected these various ports. One example here was the Newcastle and Frenchtown Turnpike. And this was just a privately owned road that the stagecoach would use. And that way the stagecoach company could guarantee that the road was in order, as we saw in that advertisement. If there was an issue with the road, right, it was on the stagecoach operator to figure out how to get the stagecoach to where it belonged. But if the bridge was out or if there was some other kind of problem, then this could be very problematic for that stagecoach operator. So turnpikes worked fairly well, except stagecoaches still were very unreliable. They were very prone to breaking down and whatnot. So this is where we see sort of the beginning, the genesis of the idea of a railroad. And the very early railroads looked a lot like stagecoach lines, with the functional update of the interface between the wheels and the ground, right? So by standardizing that interface between the wheels and the ground by using rails of some kind, the performance of a stagecoach line could be significantly improved. So what we have here is, there was a series of turnpikes, and then eventually, the idea was such, hey, why don't we build this thing? They're using these in the UK now. It's called a railroad, and let's see here. This is some of the first examples we're going to start with on the Eastern Shore of the development of what we would recognize today as rail operations. And this is the Newcastle and Frenchtown Railroad. So first we have to talk about Frenchtown a little bit. We know where Newcastle is. That's on the Delaware River. No big deal. Frenchtown is an interesting story as well. It's now a ghost town. Doesn't exist anymore. But at the time, it was one of the most northern Chesapeake Bay ports that passenger ships could get to, which could transfer you over to a stagecoach line. So the idea was, okay, hey, instead of this stagecoach line, we're going to run a rail line from Frenchtown to Newcastle. And this will be really great. We'll be able to zip people back and forth in sort of an amazing speed, something like 25 miles an hour, right? Nobody had ever done that before. And that will cut down significantly on the costs involved. And so this corporation was founded in 1827. It was built 1832 and completed, as shown in this map here, from Newcastle to Frenchtown. We're going to talk a little bit about how these early railroads were built in another slide here, but important things to know. At first, these railroads did not use steam engines. They used horse-drawn stagecoaches, essentially, right? Just take a stagecoach and fit it for rail operation, and that's what these very early operations were. And this one does have, the Newcastle and Frenchtown does have sort of the interesting historical footnote as being, while the Baltimore and Ohio was the first it was the first common carrier railroad. Common carrier meaning would accept any sort of freight or passengers from anyone, as opposed to just specific companies or owners. The Newcastle and Frenchtown was actually the first common carrier railroad that actually was an interstate common carrier railroad. It was the first railroad to span 2 states between Maryland and Delaware. So a little bit of a claim to fame for the Newcastle and Frenchtown and for the Delmarva Peninsula. These early trips took about an hour. So what might have taken you half a day or a day by stagecoach, right, by this modern railroad now took an hour to get back and forth between them. And the state of Delaware was actually an early investor in this. They actually put up some money to float the company early on. But because this is so early on, there's very little that remains of some of the Newcastle and Frenchtown, and there's very little material that actually still exists about it. So, but we are lucky enough to have an advertisement here from the Newcastle and Frenchtown Railroad here on the right, where you can see essentially what these are, stagecoaches. Later on, they did adopt steam power, which we'll talk about here in a second. So thinking back a couple slides here, we have a situation where if you're in Washington or Baltimore, right, what you would do is you would take a ship to Frenchtown. You travel up the Chesapeake Bay via ship to Frenchtown. You get on the Newcastle and Frenchtown Railroad. You take it to Newcastle. You would get on another ship. That ship would take you up the Delaware River to Trenton or thereabouts, or Camden area, right, where there was another railroad there called the Camden and Amboy. And it did just what these are not particularly creative names for railroads, right? They just kind of said, hey, we start here, we go here. And the Camden and Amboy fulfilled a very similar job to the Newcastle and Frenchtown. It was to get you the rest of the way across New Jersey so that you could get back on a New York City harbor ferry boat of some kind, and you could get the rest of your way up to either New York or possibly New England, if that's where you were headed. And while nothing exists as far as equipment from the Newcastle and Frenchtown Railroad, we do have examples of equipment that are contemporaneous from the Camden and Amboy Railroad. And one of the best examples here is what the locomotive number 1, which was called the John Bull. This locomotive, actually a replica of this locomotive, is at the Railroad Museum of Pennsylvania, where we will go later. And so I've put this tag here on this slide to remind us, like, this is one that we'll be able to see. And so that will be very exciting. The actual locomotive itself is at the Smithsonian. I believe it's the National Museum of American History. And this is the actual locomotive itself in this picture. This is not a replica. This is the actual locomotive. They took it out of the museum and they actually ran it in the 1980s as part of an exhibition, which was pretty cool to see something like that. This particular locomotive is important. It's important because it was one of the early examples of steam traction power that was pulling passenger and freight trains. This particular one was built by Robert Stephenson, who is most famous for essentially inventing steam locomotion in the United Kingdom. This locomotive was built in England. It was sent over here by ship, and it arrived in boxes. And it did not come with any instructions. So the mechanics and engineers of the Camden and Amboy Railroad had to essentially put this thing together with no information at all. But they managed to do it. It earned the nickname, although it was numbered number 1, it earned the nickname John Bull. John Bull was sort of a personification of the United Kingdom as a whole in the 19th century, right? So like kind of like our Uncle Sam sort of figure. Back then, sort of John Bull was like the United Kingdom. Okay, so being as that this locomotive came from England, they started calling it that, the John Bull, and the name stuck. It went through a bunch of different retrofits and changes over the years. Here, pictured here, it's sort of in its original form with just a flat car behind it. It was wood burning. Later on, they added like a shed to the back, which kind of looks funny today, but that's, why not add a shed to the back of it? That'll work, I think. Keep everybody dry. Maybe, I don't know. Certainly doesn't look like a train by modern standards, but so I also have in my notes here to talk about gauge. So early rail operations, they were very much inventing the technology as they went. And people were experimenting. Different rail operations were experimenting with different things. One of them was gauge. The gauge is the distance between the rails. In our modern times, we have a standard gauge, which is 4 foot 8.5 inches, or 1,435 millimeters. And just purely by convention, many countries in the entirety of North America, right, has adopted this as its interstate commerce sort of gauge for rail operations. But this was a hotly debated topic early on. There were multiple different gauges. They were competing. We actually had in the United States multiple different gauges. And later on, sort of Robert Stephenson, who invented the locomotive, was asked, why did he choose 4 foot 8.5 inches as a gauge, right? There's a lot of theories about this, right? Well, that's because the stagecoaches used that was the difference between the wheels of the stagecoaches, and it's like, well, why is it that? Well, that's because that was the Roman chariots or whatever, and you could go back and forth, and I think maybe anecdotally the best sort of explanation as to why it's 4 foot 8.5 was because that's generally the space that 2 horses need to walk side by side. But as I mentioned, when Robert Stephenson was asked, he said, why did you choose 4 foot 8.5 inches? He said, quote, "If I had been called upon to do so, it would be very difficult for me to give a good reason for the adoption of such an odd measure." So the mystery will probably never be solved as to why this has been adopted. But even one of the early inventors and leader of the technology at the time, he couldn't even give a good answer, which is a pretty interesting footnote there for history. Let's see if I can advance here. All right, here's another example that is at the Railroad Museum of Pennsylvania. This is called the Rocket. It's of similar design to the John Bull. It didn't run on either the Newcastle and Frenchtown or the Camden and Amboy, right? But it is contemporaneous to the two, and it's very similar to many of the locomotives that would have operated, right? Especially early on. I'm not going to go into the functional aspects of how a steam locomotive works because we only have a little bit of time here. So there is a sidetrack warning. There's plenty of information out there about how steam locomotives work in more detail, right? These early steam locomotives used a boiler or a firebox here, which you can see one of the bigger advancements in technology was mating sort of a vertical firebox, which you see here in this dome, with sort of a horizontal boiler with tubes in it. That's in this picture. You can see this area that's horizontal would hold the water. The heat from the fire would travel through the tubes of the boiler and heat the water up into steam. And then later, this hot exhaust gases would be directed up the stack, and this steam that was generated would be collected in this dome, and then directed down to the cylinders, which in this case you can't see because the cylinders were underneath the locomotive itself. And once this system was adopted, it would remain the general practice for over 100 years in rail locomotive design. Right, this general idea did not change for that entire period. Let's advance. There we go. So passenger cars, early passenger cars were also very crude. There's not a good example of a really, really early one at the Railroad Museum of Pennsylvania. If you want to see a great example of one of the first passenger cars, there's a great example at the B&O Railroad Museum, right? And these were the ones they were basically built at stagecoaches. You took a stagecoach body and you suspended it from leather straps on a tiny little flat car. And that way the flat car would sort of jog down the track, right? But the suspension would even it out a little bit, and the passengers would be in what they already recognized as a stagecoach. And this worked fairly well, briefly, right? But pretty quick, there were capacity issues. There were smoothness of ride problems. There was crashworthiness problems. There were derailment problems with this. And this is an example here. This is the number 3 passenger car, which is at the Railroad Museum of Pennsylvania. This is 1836, so pretty early on. Rail operators were thinking, okay, well, what if we took 2 of those little flat cars and instead of putting stagecoach bodies on them, we sort of string them together and then build a shed, right? And then in that shed, we can put all the seats and everything. That might work better. We could get more seats in there because it's spanned across 2 little flat cars, right? The ride will be much smoother as well. And this worked. This worked really well. As we can see by 1836, right, we had the basic form of what we know as a passenger car today. So, from 1836 till today, almost 200 years, this basic technology has not changed any farther. What else did I want to mention here? Yes, so safety on these cars was not great. There was cast iron, right? So the harder, the more the pieces that required high strength, like the trucks and the wheels and things, those were all cast iron. However, all the car body work was all wood. And wood is cheap and available. However, it burns, obviously. It also breaks. And when you have moving vehicles that are made out of wood, if they should come into contact with each other, potentially really bad stuff happens as the various pieces, could fly apart, especially inside the car where you have people. Shards of wood, broken things could not be great. And there are many examples of this happening, right? So early railroads, even though they had low speeds, were incredibly dangerous. We don't have any good anecdotes of any accidents that occurred on the Newcastle and Frenchtown Railroad. But once again, we have many contemporaneous examples from similar railroads. One I wanted to share from the Camden and Amboy Railroad was the story of the Hightstown train wreck. So November 8th, 1833, we had a train operating from Camden and a train operating from Amboy, right? No, I'm sorry. This is a different example here. So November 8th, 1833, right? This is 2 months after the adoption of steam locomotives for the first time, right? And this was a great, much talked about public event, right? The trains were now reaching 35 miles an hour, right? As a result of this steam locomotion. And this was a social phenomenon, right? So people were coming out to ride this, to see what it's about. And one of the folks who was very interested in this, pictured on right here, is Cornelius Vanderbilt. Cornelius Vanderbilt came out this day. He said, what are these new things called railroads? He was at the time a shipping executive, owner of a steamship line himself, but he was not involved in railroads yet. So he said, what are these new railroads here? He came out, he bought a ticket, he got on the train. He started to experience, oh, this is interesting. We're going 35 miles an hour. At the same time, on this very same train, we had former president at this time, John Quincy Adams, also, riding for essentially novelty, right? What are these trains and how do they work? And so everybody's having a good time. The train's going down the track when all of a sudden a wheel on one of the cars breaks. The wheel falls off. The car crashes into the ground. The car behind it collides with the first car, causing the car to disintegrate. The result of this, two passengers are killed. 22 passengers are injured. Cornelius Vanderbilt himself breaks his leg. He decides railroads are terrible. I'm never going to ride one again, supposedly. This is anecdotal. And from then on, he would have a long career in actually owning and operating railroads. Former President John Quincy Adams was not injured, but he did say later that this crash was the most dreadful catastrophe my eyes had ever beheld, right? So the takeaway from this was, rail technology had advanced to the point of sort of achieving more than it could perhaps safely, right, with the idea of reliability and passenger safety, certainly.
Thomas, we have a question
Yes.
in the chat. Was railroad development on the Eastern Shore driven by freight or by passengers?
It will be both, and we're going to talk about that more here as we go. But certainly early on, both of them are important parts of this.
Thank you.
All right, so canals. We have the Chesapeake and Delaware Canal. The Chesapeake and Delaware Canal was built in 1829, so it's actually predates the Newcastle and Frenchtown Railroad. However, the original Chesapeake and Delaware Canal was very small. You had to pay to use it. It could not accommodate the ocean-going ships that many people were using to travel around. So at least initially, the rail connection from the Chesapeake Bay to the Delaware River was still the more advantageous connection. However, by 1857, the canal is widened and improved, and it creates a situation where the overland connection between the Chesapeake Bay and the Bay of Delaware is no longer really as competitive as it used to be. Instead of having to take your ship to Frenchtown, unload it all onto the train, take the train to Newcastle, put it back on a boat, you can just put it on one ship, send it the entire way to Philadelphia through the canal, and never have to unload it. So by 1857, the half of the railroad is closed. The western half of the railroad is closed, and Frenchtown itself disappears and ceases to be an important Chesapeake Bay port. By 1919, the Army Corps of Engineers come through and widen the canal once more into its present form, which we know today as being a significant waterway that's free and open to use by whatever ocean go or whatever waterborne craft need to use it. This would be a very interesting topic. I'm going to stop while I'm ahead here, but this would be a great sidetrack as well. All right, so the stage is set here at this point. That's the Newcastle and Frenchtown Railroad. The stage is set sort of for expansion onto the rest of the Delmarva Peninsula, right? And we have a couple maps here showing the various different times, how the network evolved and how it worked within itself. I do want to draw your attention to the map here on the right side, showing Maryland kind of in green. The Delmarva Peninsula, the eastern part of the Delmarva Peninsula obviously drains into the Delaware River and the Atlantic Ocean. The western part drains into the Chesapeake Bay. The dividing line between these two watersheds sort of forms a spine that runs down the Delmarva Peninsula itself. But it runs through Delaware most keenly. And this is going to be an important factor in how the rail network evolved. You could essentially walk this entire line in green without ever having to cross any kind of creek or waterway, right? You could walk this entire way down and never get your foot wet. If you were to, for example, to try to walk through Maryland, however, you would unfortunately encounter many significant rivers, Sassafras, the Chester, the Choptank, the Nanticoke, right, and the Wacomico, just to name some of them, right? So the farther you get away from this divide, the more challenging your geography gets, and that's going to be an important part of our conversation here in another couple of slides. And this is where I talk about the handouts. Hopefully you're able to look, or you can look at some point. I'm going to be referring back to this map and the next slide as well. Delmarva Peninsula is not real suited to landscape, right? It's more of a portrait type of a region, but unfortunately, to get it on the screen here, we have to turn it. So this is our Delmarva Peninsula map, and I've turned it 90 degrees. Of course, feel free to orient your map in any way that's most helpful for you. What we're looking at here is I have all the different rail segments here labeled and numbered, and then sort of their key junction points here written in. And so this will help us sort of get an understanding of the lay of the land as we go, and we'll talk about different parts of this map. The important part here is that these numbers correspond to the timeline, and I've tried to put this chart together, and it's pretty busy looking. Don't be intimidated at first by looking at this, but this is an aid to help everybody along here. Those numbered segments correspond to lines on this map, rows that is. So we have number 1 and number 2, for example, are the Newcastle and Frenchtown, and there are various dates and colors that correspond to different activities that were going on those segments. At the bottom here, we see our timeline. The timeline of this chart runs from about 1825 to today, 2025, a nice clean 200 years. And what you'll see is sort of the creation and elimination of these segments over the course of time. And hopefully when we meet next week, this will make more sense. But there's going to be a lot of different stories about these different pieces, and this is sort of intended to help keep them manageable as we jump around geographically. But working from the left to the right, we start at the very beginning. We've already talked about the Newcastle and Frenchtown Railroad, and then we will move on to some of these other examples in other parts. And we'll eventually, speak about some places that are very local here to Easton and Talbot County. All right, let's move on. Move on, clicker. Come on, clicker. There we go. So, about this time, the Newcastle and Frenchtown Railroad was operating um, in the very young United States, trying to find its way in sort of a global economy to some degree, right? Ocean-going global economy. There was a lot of interest in railroads and rail development, right? So sort of today we hear about cryptocurrency or whatever, and these are very popular, speculative sort of endeavors. A lot of money being drawn in and for various things, and that was basically what railroads were 200 years ago. They were sort of the crypto of their time, for better or for worse, and many of the same storylines apply between here and there. But by and large, the way railroads worked was, hey, you lived in a little town. You maybe never left your little town, or maybe you never left your county. And there's this new technology that might promise to allow you to see the rest of the country, or at least travel and bring you things that maybe you've never had before, bring you products. And so what unfolded was sort of local groups of people, business people, local prominent citizens and whatnot would gather together. They would form groups. Maybe they would get a county or a state to support them. And they would start the business themselves. A lot of these folks didn't know what railroads were or how they worked necessarily, but they were able to acquire that knowledge and acquire that experience. And a lot of these railroads were constructed locally, which is a pretty interesting feature here. But a key sort of mechanism of this was the stock corporation. So to actually fund a company, you need money. In lieu of an income at first, what you do is you can issue ownership shares of a company, and that's what we're looking at here. These are stock certificates, and railroad would take your money, and in exchange for the money, they would give you one of these that says, hey, you're part owner of this company. And the idea was that you might give them, say, the one on the upper left here is $1,000, which is a pretty significant amount of money, but perhaps it's 50 or 100 or whatnot. And you would own one share. And this one share, the railroad would take that $1,000, it would invest it in a track or a property of some kind, right? It would be, that money is no longer cash money, but it's now represented sort of as a valuable commodity of some kind, like a real estate or an asset. And so your stock price was directly related to the value, like the net liquidation value of the company, right? So if the company were to be taken apart again, the opposite way, they would be able to pay your money back, right? That's called par value. Later on, many years later, 100 years later, people started thinking about shares in companies less in terms of their par value, less in terms of what they actually represented, and more in terms of a speculative value based on the sort of nebulous idea of what the company could produce as far as an income, right? And that sort of speculative sort of nature of this came in about 50 to 100 years down the road, right? But early on, right, you would buy a share, you would think, hey, I own this $100 share. I anticipate getting my $100 back from this share, right? Not having it appreciate in any significant way. Another way a railroad would raise money was by issuing bonds. Bonds are essentially loans, right? You're not getting anything in exchange for a bond, but the promise that the railroad will pay it back with interest. These are securities, and they allow a railroad to raise money, but they do add to their debt load, right? But those were heavily used as well. Typically, those are preferential above stocks, so we'll talk about that a little bit later as well. Another important thing for a rail company early on, if you wanted to start one, right, was that you needed a charter. So you would have to go to your state legislature. You'd have to say, hey, I'd like to start a business. The legislature would have to give you permission to start the business. That came in the form of a charter. We actually still basically have this system today. If you want to start a business, you have to, and we don't call them charters anymore, but you still have to get documentation from the state, and there's a whole different process for this now. Originally, every single request had to go to the legislature. And state legislatures early on were swamped with requests for railroads, right? Everybody wanted to start one. I'd like to go, the left side of my yard to the right side of my yard and Western Railroad, right? Like a lot of these were pretty harebrained, and they had to sort of work through kind of a backlog of requests for these. But a charter, what it is a written grant by a legislative body, which allows a company certain rights and privileges, i.e., like in this case, doing business. And an important part of this was the state will let you go into business, right? But the trade here is that the business is intended to serve the public good. And what that means has evolved significantly over the course of time, right? Originally, it was very much you are oriented toward the public good, and what you need to do is make sure that you are first serving the public with your operation, right? We'll see that sort of timeline unfold over the next couple weeks. So we can now talk about extending southward. We're trying to link up Delmarva, right? And the rivalry between Maryland and Pennsylvania was still very real, especially as we mentioned in the 1730s. This resulted in the creation of the Mason-Dixon line. The Mason-Dixon line is remembered as being the horizontal line between Pennsylvania and Maryland. Those of us who have visited Delmar know that the Mason-Dixon line actually runs all the way south to the Trans-Peninsular line, and it begins at this corner here. All of this was sort of determined by Mason and Dixon, who were the famous surveyors. This is a whole, perhaps a whole nother, area of study on its own. But Delaware eventually separates from Pennsylvania, becomes its own state in 1776, along with everybody else. And these different states are now that all of these border lines are settled, we're no longer warring with our neighbor state. Sort of these cross-state jealousies have to take a new form, and the form that they take is in commerce, right? So you have states like Maryland competing with states like Pennsylvania for westward expansion. Maryland is very focused on westward expansion with the creation of the B&O Railroad, right? Delaware, poor little Delaware, doesn't get the chance to try to expand westward because it's sort of limited by its geography and doesn't have any of that opportunity. So Delaware takes a different sort of view, and that's going to result in some key decisions being made. But before we get into Delaware, Maryland was first to attempt a linear rail corridor on Delmarva, right? And in, let me see here, 1833, the Maryland legislature chartered the Eastern Shore Railroad, specifically Rail Space Road. And this railroad was to stretch along the north-south length of Delmarva to, quote, some point from quote, some point in Cecil County, roughly along the Maryland and Delaware line, to the southern part of Somerset County. And the state legislature, there's a big background story to this, but long story short, the legislature appropriated money for this. similarly to how it appropriated money for the B&O Railroad. Surveys were complete for this line. It was laid out, and even some grading and construction was done. And this is where our friend General Thomas Emory comes back into the story here. Some very early in our slideshow, we had that quote, right, about the straightest, most level, profitable railroad on the face of the globe. And that was this man here, General Thomas Emory, who wrote that in a report to the Maryland legislature. Thomas Emory fought in the War of 1812. He fought at the Battle of Queenstown in the War of 1812, over here on Delmarva. And he was promoted through the ranks of the military, becoming quite prominent. He was a member of the House of Delegates from Queen Anne's County. He was on the Maryland Governor's Council. He was also in the state Senate. In 1836, he wrote a series of articles promoting rail operations on the Eastern Shore, trying to bring a rail line to the Eastern Shore. In 1838, he was commissioned by the state of Maryland to go to England to attempt to raise money and research the technology of railroads. Ultimately, he traveled there, but he was unsuccessful in raising more money. And the money appropriated for this project was quickly spent without any other forthcoming funds. The entire enterprise sort of ground to a halt in 1840. And unfortunately, General Emory died 2 years later in 1842. So despite some work being done on this line, the Maryland legislature had budgetary issues and eventually pulled all the funding. Not much, if anything, remains of the Eastern Shore Railroad. However, if you drive on Route 50 toward Ocean City, you get close to the Hebron area of Wacomico County, you will see a road called Old Railroad Road. That road is built on the alignment of the proposed Eastern Shore Railroad that was never built. So they graded that and then never used it. So now you know when you see that one on the side of the road there. That's what the story was.
Thomas, I have a question in the chat.
Yes, go ahead.
Mark is asking, what manufacturing industries existed early on to supply railroad stock, such as cars, rails, etc.?
Oh, I have a slide for rail, so I'm going to come back to that one.
Okay.
Yeah, we're going to get to that, and actually it's the next one after this, so we'll return to that question. Okay, so we've seen Maryland's attempt to build a north-south rail corridor. Now we can see Delaware, right? So Delaware, being as that it can't focus on westward expansion at all, is able to take more of an internal view. And Delaware also charters sort of a competing rail company in 1836. It struggled through many years because of financial issues of its own. In 1849, the charter was revived by Samuel M. Harrington. Samuel Harrington was a Supreme Court judge for the state of Delaware. He is pictured here. And of course, he's the namesake for Harrington, Delaware. And I have a note here. It's hard to find portraits of him. This may be the only one that I was able to find for him. In 1849, the Delaware Railroads incorporated again, and in 1852, Delaware signs on by purchasing stock using revenue from the Newcastle and Frenchtown Railroad to guarantee cash for this construction, and proposes the railroad to interchange with the Newcastle and Frenchtown near Bear Tavern, Delaware. I believe we call that Porter's, Delaware now. A lot of these names do change over time. And so construction begins in 1852 with a line reaching Dover by 1856. So looking on our maps, we can see this is segment number 3, reaching south from Delaware Junction to Dover. By 1859, the line will reach Delmar, Maryland. and we'll set that story aside, pick it up later. This is a very early photo from Felton, Delaware, of what we would expect to see in pre-Civil War. One locomotive, one car, right? Not a whole lot of amenities, for sure. Not a lot of freight even. But so the question is, Delaware was able to deliver a north-south rail corridor spine, right? Why? Why was Delaware able to do it when Maryland failed? Part of it is funding and support, right? Part of it is going back to that geography that we mentioned earlier in the map. The divide that separates the eastern and western watersheds of the Delmarva Peninsula runs through Delaware. And so the cost of building a railroad up and down Delaware following that line is significantly less due to the lack of bridges and other structures necessary. You have no major river crossings, at least between Harrington and Pennsylvania and Wilmington, right? That's one of the major reasons. And as I mentioned as well, Delaware was more internally motivated. They couldn't focus on westward expansion like Maryland was at the time, so Delaware's only choice was to build south. Here's a little bit about building railroads. So what was available for cars, locomotives, and other materials? So rails were only produced in the United Kingdom in England before 1844. So anything built, the Newcastle and Frenchtown in this case, that would have been built with rails which would have come over from Europe through much effort to do that. In 1844, the first rail production was begun in the United States. We started seeing domestically produced rail. But that still had to travel quite far. There was no rail production here on the Eastern Shore because we have no iron. Luckily, rail operations themselves lend themselves to, moving heavy things around like that. So once you can produce rail somewhere in the United States, it's pretty easy to move it around the early network, at least relative to putting it on a ship. Locomotives. Locomotives early on were the same. They had to come from Europe. They came generally from various manufacturers in England. In slightly later on, we saw sort of the development of manufacturers in Philadelphia building steam locomotives. Famous one is Baldwin Locomotive Works. We'll see some of those when we go up to the Rail Museum of Pennsylvania. Passenger cars were a little easier. They could be built more locally in some cases. But sort of mostly you can think of an ad hoc type situation here early on. Rails themselves, I have a picture here. We'll see some examples. Early rails were very small. They were actually shaped as a U instead of as a T, as we see now. But over the course of time, these were upgraded a couple different times to what we would call a modern standard. And early on as well, railroads like the Newcastle and Frenchtown were laid iron rails on usually pieces of stone or rock. This was tried in many cases. On Delmarva, we pretty quickly realized that we don't have any rock to do any of that with. So the switch over to using timber railroad ties was very early because of our, at the time we had almost unlimited forests to cut railroad ties from. In addition, there was no stone ballast. Typically on a railroad track, you have ballast rocks on the track to try to keep the track in place. We have no stone locally available on the Eastern Shore, so if the stone couldn't be brought in by train, roadbeds had to be built from sand or clay and covered with cinders from steam locomotives, which was not advantageous, but it was cheap. And so that is those were the decisions made there. As far as labor, building railroad lines were very labor intensive. On the Eastern Shore, you'd have a gang of guys who would be digging typically drainage ditches on both sides. They would take that soil and clay and pile it up in the middle, creating a grade. They would flatten that grade out and lay out, as we see in this picture. This is from out in the western United States, but it's sort of a good example of the construction sort of visual of building a railroad, right? You lay out your ties, a gang comes in behind, putting the rails down, spiking them in. There was some immigrant labor doing this. The railroads later on could bring in special teams of immigrant labor that would do these special tasks. Early on, it was more local labor. Prior to the Civil War, in the state of Maryland, some slave labor may have been used, but there was also just very little construction in Maryland prior to the Civil War, at least on the Eastern Shore. So it's hard to know how much of it was involved with that. And a big part of building a railroad, too, is acquiring property. Acquiring property was an interesting task, especially early on. A rail company didn't have a lot of money, so they would sell stocks, maybe they would sell bonds, and they would have an amount of money, but to buy the rails and the ties and the locomotives and pay the employees and everything, this money would run out pretty quick. So they tried to assemble corridor properties as cheaply as possible. Sometimes they were able to acquire property in what we call fee simple, which is clean, simple ownership. Other times they acquired the right to cross other people's properties, which we call like owning it in an easement. But using the property sort of became a key part of this, right? Because you need to have a exclusive corridor to run your trains, and property rights with adjacent landowners became somewhat of an issue in the more rural areas, more agricultural areas where we had a lot of livestock. We had horses, we had cows, and these cows and horses did cause a number of issues with trains because cows and horses, for whatever reason, like to stand on railroad tracks. You will see, like a lot of times, fences are required by the property deeds, which is an interesting feature. We have an example. I have an example of a deed here from the Maryland. This is from Mr. P.S. Reynolds of Caroline County selling his property to the Maryland and Delaware Railroad. And it says, "This deed, made this 20th day of August in the year 1870, by P.S. Reynolds of Caroline County in the state of Maryland, witnesseth that in consideration of the advantages arising to Mr. P.S. Reynolds by the location of the Maryland and Delaware Railroad on his property, and the construction of a station thereon, and the continuation of the same, and a free pass for himself and his family over said road, in all services on that road, the said Mr. P.S. Reynolds doth grant unto the Maryland and Delaware Railroad Company all and singular that part of the tract belonging to Mr. Reynolds, situated on the east side of the Tuckahoe Creek in Queen Anne's County." So basically, hey, sure, if you want to build a railroad through my farm, go ahead, but I would like a free ticket, please, at least. And so these kinds of deals sort of did unfold quite often. We see it pretty often through here. All right, let me find my clicker arrow. All right, so while we have the Eastern Shore Railroad and the Delaware Railroad sort of unfolding, there's interesting happenings going on farther inland. We have the Philadelphia, Wilmington, and Baltimore, which was the first significant connection between those cities via rail. And this was a corporation originally independent, and it was founded to connect those cities, Philadelphia, Washington, and Baltimore. By 1838, this was complete, and this is the sort of railroad of fame related to Frederick Douglass's escape. Here's a picture of the President Street train station in Baltimore City, which is still there. This is the terminating point in Baltimore, and this is its own sort of side story here. But the Philadelphia, Wilmington, and Baltimore, because of its sort of crucial connection, became one of the really important parts of this early on, right? So now instead of getting a ship from Baltimore, you have to go up through the canal, right, and then carry on. You could just get on a PW&B train. Originally, you would have to take a ferry here along the Susquehanna River. Later, a bridge was built, so you didn't have to change. But in any case, this train connection reduced the time necessary to travel between the two places almost by an order of magnitude. So this is a much more competitive way. And certainly, stagecoaches by this time just couldn't. You wouldn't want to do that. That would take much too long. So the PW&B. We're gonna talk about a lot of railroads with a lot of acronyms, maybe an alphabet soup. The PW&B is going to be an early one. Sometimes it's helpful to give railroads monikers based on their acronyms. The best I could come up with this one is Pretty Wild and Belligerent. Right, I don't know, not for any particular reason, but you can feel free to come up with your own if it helps you keep them straight. But the Philadelphia, Wilmington, and Baltimore, the Pretty Wild and Belligerent probably wasn't too far off. Let me see here. So this PW&B acquired the Newcastle and Frenchtown in 1840. As we mentioned earlier, part of the Newcastle and Frenchtown became obsolete by 1857, and so the purpose of the remaining part of that was almost entirely just to connect the rest of the Delmarva Peninsula. And both the Pennsylvania Railroad, the much larger and state-oriented Pennsylvania Railroad, and the early B&O Railroad in Baltimore, right? They both jockeyed to try to own this PW&B. And this was essentially a commercial battleground between the two railroads for a number of years. Eventually, in 1881, the Pennsylvania Railroad would come to own this portion, and that is another part we will discuss briefly, I think, next week. All right. We're almost, we're moving along here. I'm going to have to skim over some of this a little bit, but we're going to start to talk about some of the branching out, right? So we've talked about the main stem, segment number 3 that runs down to Delmar, segment number 3 and segment number 4. And Delaware sort of gets wide the farther south you go. And one rail corridor wasn't enough for access for various reasons. And so a rail company called the Junction and Breakwater was incorporated in 1856 to leave the main stem of the Delaware Railroad. At that time, the town was called Clark's Corners. Later, it was called Milford Junction, and later on, still, it's now called Harrington, Delaware. And this was sort of a critical area that would connect these two major rail lines together. The purpose of this Junction and Breakwater Railroad was originally to connect more of the coastal areas of Delaware and ultimately to extend south, potentially as far as the end of the peninsula. 1859, this corridor reaches Milford, Delaware. From 1859 to 1868, it's actually operated by the PW&B. In 1869, it reaches Georgetown and Lewes, Delaware. Later, it would reach Rehoboth, and Rehoboth would be established as a resort vacation beachfront town that you could reach by train. In 1874, the J&B was acquired by the PWB and sort of morphed into its operation. I'm going to skip over a little bit of this for the sake of time. The Eastern Shore Railroad comes back again. So the Eastern Shore Railroad, which did not at first sort of come to pass the way it was envisioned, but the charter sort of still existed. So by the time the Delaware Railroad reached Delmar, um, citizens of Wacomico and Somerset County were lobbying for an extension of the railroad from the Delaware state line south, ultimately to reach its original destination of Summers Cove. Summers Cove is where we now know as Crisfield. So in 1860, this corridor was open to Salisbury, and it would be the last piece of rail corridor built before the Civil War, at least on our Delmarva Peninsula here. During the Civil War, it played an important role. The Union Army strung a telegraph cable from Salisbury south to Cape Charles and then ultimately across the Chesapeake Bay. And using the telegraph cable along the rest of the railroad line, this formed an important communications link for the Union war effort. The line was finished to Summers Cove and Crisfield in 1866. It was renamed to Crisfield after the railroad's president, John Crisfield. And in 1868, Wacomico County and Somerset County become two separate counties. Prior to that, it was all Somerset County. With a port on the Chesapeake Bay, Crisfield serves as an important terminal between steamships going south and rail operations going north. Passengers and freight could transfer from one to the other there at Crisfield. And this was operated this way for a while, but challenges with connecting the steamboats' timetables and the railroad's timetables made it a little bit difficult to do. The line was extended to Kings Creek and the Pocomoke River near Pocomoke City in 1871. But one of the main uses of these lines was gathering maritime and agricultural commodities like fisheries, oysters, other products from the Chesapeake Bay, right? Packaging them, sending them up to the cities of the Northeast United States. Let's go up to the Civil War here. Civil War, right? This could be its own special lecture, which we're not going to do, hopefully. But it's suffice to say, during the war, nothing happened. Nothing got built, right? No construction was happening. Maryland remained a slave state during the duration of the war. A lot of conflicting sympathies in our state, and this sort of manifested itself in sort of conflicts that would flare up locally. The PW&B used the railroad to move troops north and south, much to the chagrin of many local folks in some cases. Railroads in general were playing a huge role in the conflict, but as there wasn't any sort of significant military action on the Eastern Shore, there wasn't a huge role really for the rail operator. There was no money available, no labor, no materials to continue building. So all of these sort of ambitions to expand the network would have to wait until after the war. And we will briefly talk about Tench Tillman. Hopefully I have enough time still. Can I keep going, Trina, or should I stop?
Well, I would say that this seems like it might be a good place to stop.
Okay, I will adjust.
If you can do it in a couple of minutes, I don't think people would mind you going a couple of minutes over.
No, I don't. We'll just have to. We can adjust. I'll adjust my slideshow because these are taking a little longer than I anticipated, which is fine. And we'll leave it there. Maybe I can jump ahead. So we will come back to the rest of our slides today for the sake of time. Pick up where we left off. And next time, section 2, we will talk about basically, well, we're going to change it to the Civil War, right? Civil War, we're going to cover Civil War to about the mid-1970s. But let's give some time for some questions, maybe, if there are any.
I don't have anything new, but people chime in if you've got a question for them.
Just a quick question on the stagecoach kind of thing where they had the seats up on the top. Were there problems with people falling off? That looked terribly unstable.
Yes, definitely. That was sort of a holdover from Stagecoach design, which I'm not an expert on that per se, but I think that as a problem, and maybe I can jump back to that. Yeah. So that as an issue and many other issues pretty quickly led to the end of that kind of standard until what we saw a little bit later. Something like that, which is what we would recognize as much safer and more accommodating. But yes, people did fall off of there. It was sort of a different time, where you're like responsible for your own safety, and if you fell off of that and were severely hurt, it was like sort of your fault and not anybody else's. So for better or for worse.
Yeah. Thanks.
It also looks like they'd be burned from the cinders from the smokestack too.
Oh yeah. Good
Or
point.
maybe you'd be breathing the smoke and the fumes, which also probably wouldn't be pleasant.
Yeah. Tom, one final question. Frenchtown is in what state?
Frenchtown is in Maryland.
Okay. Thank you.
It is a ghost town now. There's nothing there anymore, but it's at the head of the Elk River.
Okay.
There is a Frenchtown Road that still remains, but the port and the wharf and everything are all gone because it's almost its sole purpose was to connect the turnpike and the railroad over to Newcastle. Once that was obsolete, there was no purpose in the town there.
All right. I guess that's a good place to end. I've got one comment. I don't know if you can look at comments now. Suzanne says, so tickled to have such detailed info about the railroads that employed several of my family members for their lifetimes. So that's kind of cool. And then thank yous. And next week's weather looks better, folks, so we can see each other in person. Zoom will still be available should you want to. But thank you, Tom.
Thank you.
I'm actually glad this is taking longer than I thought, because what I didn't want happen was have it be quicker. So we'll adjust for next week, and we'll move pretty quick, but we'll cover what we need to cover, I think. So thank you, everybody.
Thank you.